So basically, the way this started was I summarily began to bore my husband and mother by walking them through the crosstabs.
Right. Okay. Of the YouGov and the New York Times.
Yeah, both of them.
Right.
Because very helpfully, they provide you with, the New York Times Siena poll provides you with the crosstabs, and YouGov has these little drop downs where you can cut it by gender and region and other things.
Yeah.
And so just sort of explaining, like, this one's a survey of like 3,000 plus people who are 18 plus in the YouGov panel. And this one is likely voters and about, I don't remember what it was, like 1,200 people, something like that. One's more a candidate poll, one's more an issue questionnaire. These are not really apples to apples comparisons. And then hilariously, as I was putting together the list of links for us to talk about today, there's like what I would consider to be like an updated YouGov question that's like,
okay.
I mean, do you think that this should be decided by the Supreme Court, or do you just want to have a vote? And it was kind of like, okay, no one really thinks Colorado was wrong to take Trump off the ballot. Most people think the Supreme Court is going to hear the case and is going to overturn it.
Yeah.
And then when asked, like, do you think we'd just be better off if we just let's just have a vote? Like, the answer is mostly, yeah, let's just have a vote. Like, let's let the voters solve this problem.
Right. Okay.
So
and that was an additional question that YouGov added.
I think I included it in the list because there was, maybe I didn't. Let's see. Oh, it's under the what about this more recent question, the Trump eligibility. This is the YouGov poll. Let's see. This was released on the 4th of January. So it was, oh my gosh. I think they conducted this. This was with The Economist and YouGov. They ran it from December 31st to January 2nd. They asked whether voters, the courts, and Congress should be able to determine if Donald Trump should be able to run for president in 2024. They could select multiple options. 62% said voters should be able to determine whether Trump runs again, including majorities of Democrats and independents, and 75% of Republicans. Fewer said the court should be able to make that determination. 42%, though.
Right.
Which is 55% of Democrats, but only 28% of Republicans. 20% said Congress should be able to determine his eligibility. So like it's a follow-up question that happens a couple weeks after the first set of questions that, I started this with.
Right.
But, it's the difference between, there's a lot of kind of methodological distinctions here, right? Like, it's not forced choice, it's multiple choice. For another, it's, a much, well, let me see actually what the total number of responses is on that second one. I don't even know if I can see it. I'd have to scroll down a little bit more, but this one, this was 1,500 U.S. adult citizens. So again, it's citizens, not likely voters or registered voters. And all of this kind of came about as like a discussion about not all polls are the same. And not all polls are trying to do the same thing. And if relatively experienced, intelligent people like Chris Hayes and his production team are trying to kind of compare these two things that are, they're interesting to look at side by side, but they're not direct comparison polls. One is not like an added layer to the other. It's kind of more like seeping up from the groundwater kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And then people may make some inferences here that maybe they shouldn't make. Maybe they should. But part of the idea was just to sort of say, like, I think one of the things that comes up every time there's an election year is this hand-wringing about whether we can trust the polls, whatever that means, trust it to do what, I don't know. And I think a lot of it is because people don't really know what bias is. They don't really know what sample size or sample design is. They don't know what a margin of error is. They don't know the difference between one type of poll or another. They don't know that there have been all these changes in method. And so maybe it might be nice to not have any hot takes about what the polls say and what we think they mean or what we predict is going to happen next. But instead just kind of go, well, what's in here? What's not in here? Who they ask? Who didn't they ask? How'd they ask them? How didn't they ask them?
Right.
And then like should you get too excited about this? Maybe. No. Yes. So anyway, so I had a thought about that, and both my husband and mother really enjoyed this conversation, surprisingly. I was like, I'm sorry, I'm boring you. They're like, no, keep going. Which probably speaks to the pathology of my chosen family and actual family. This is why I am this way. But then literally, Stuart, my husband, was like, you should do a podcast about this. You should get Paul to do it with you. Right. And then a few days later, he comes in after walking the dog, and he's like, it should be called Crosstabs.
And here we are.
Here we are. At which point I'm like, all right, I'm registering URLs and setting up a ghost site and setting up an Acast. And so, so here we are. That's how we got to here, Paul. Okay. And then I emailed you, and you were very nice and said, sure.
I always say yes to you, Farrah.
Oh, that's why I like you. If only more people would do that.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So I think maybe it's worth just sort of, before we even start talking about these specific polls. Yeah. I think I also was having a conversation with a friend of mine who was like, well, really, you're starting this thing as if you don't have enough to do. And then she was like, and you know what year it is? And I was like, it's an election year. And she's like, and you know what people freak out about in election years? And I was like, the polls. The polls. And so I think the kind of things I was, thinking about for stuff we could talk about are just this kind of meta conversation about the roles that polling plays in our democracy, what they're for, how people, whether we think they're still good, either for the things that they're for or for just sort of democracy in general. Jill Lepore has gone on the record many times with feelings about whether she thinks polls are good for democracy. Right. Nate Silver has generally taken a different position. And everybody can have fights about it in between. And then I just think there's some demystification about what the heck is a margin of error? Yeah.
Are people lying?
When I look at this, how, I mean, are people lying, or are they just misinformed? Are they doing this performative response? Yeah. If we're having non-response bias, people refusing to participate in polls, what should we make of that? What's waiting anyway? There was a Wall Street Journal piece a few months ago that was waiting is bad. And I'm like, waiting is standard.
Right. It's very standard. Yeah.
So there's some things that are just maybe we could, open the curtain a little bit and explain what some of these things are. And I have no predictions about what's going to happen, because if you want to hear my predictions, it's pretty depressing.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting
that's my
questions.
Bias.
I think if you start off with the one with regards to what are polls trying to achieve, or what are they, what do they do? I think we tend to see a poll result and we think, oh my God, that's going to be the outcome of the election. Because if the question is literally, if the election were held today, how would you vote? But of course, the election isn't being held today, and it's not being held tomorrow. And a lot of times it's been held 6 months, in the future. And so polls aren't really reflective of what's going to happen at an election. They're only reflective of what the electorate thinks about the political situation at that given moment. So lots can happen between a poll and an election, obviously. So I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of polls that are done really early on that try to be presented as kind of, oh, this is going to happen, when really they're not. And that those polls, well before an election cycle has started, probably aren't that useful, I think, because there's a whole campaign that's going to go on. It's going to persuade people one way or the other, and there's lots of events that are going to happen. So I don't really put a lot of stock in polling that's well before elections. And I don't know if that kind of polling is really that useful either, in terms of, if you're thinking about it in terms of what it's general kind of plus or minus on society, because it probably just gets a lot of people worried on either side about what's going to happen, when really, it's very early on in the whole process.
Right. So that actually is a thing I keep wondering about, because obviously, American elections are, I think, a little bit unique in the world in that they seem to be constantly going on.
Yes, right.
And we don't have any kind of regulations about when the actual campaigning can begin.
Mm.
And so in a general election year, the kind of custom is that the campaign really begins January of the election year, because that's when the first primaries are held. Except that, of course, people had to get on to the primary ballots in these states. They had to campaign. And we have now these, constant kind of a large slate of candidates who start running in primaries, not every time and not every party, but like the Republican slate had been quite large. It's now winnowed down a bit more. But they've been having to qualify to get onto debate stages in order to get any kind of press and all of that. And so we have polling then in order to qualify them to get onto a Fox Business or CNN or Univision or whatever debate stage. And also, I think these campaigns are using it to try to give them some indicators of, should they even try to compete in state X or Y? Where should they put their resources? All of that. And so I think that's the other thing is we've got national polling, which it feels like we've got a lot of. And then we have state level polling, which helps them make decisions about primary battles. And those don't happen very often. There are either places where they almost don't happen at all, or they're very infrequent. Like the Iowa poll, I don't think we have an update on the Iowa poll yet. I think they only do that about once a month at most, and not really until pretty close to January. And so I imagine that kind of resource allocation questions, I guess. And stuff like that.
I think that the campaigns themselves will be doing polling. It's not public. So I think a good use of polling for a campaign would be to do all that kind of stuff and to keep an eye on kind of where you are. I mean, if you were advising to a campaign, I think early political polling in lots of states and understanding where the candidate is a really good use of it. But early polling to predict the presidential election, from the public's perspective, I think it's just like trying to get some interesting journalistic, commentary out there. It's not really that useful, but for a campaign, I think it's really, really valuable.
So maybe talk a bit about because you have done some political research in the U.S., but more in where your accent comes from.
Yes, more in New Zealand. So I used to do the political polling in a company called CM Research back in New Zealand, and we did. Typically, you as a poller or as a research company, you would partner with one of the networks. So we partnered with one of the television networks, and they would commission polls that we would do around election season to kind of like indicate, what the general gist of the election, where it was kind of going, and we would do that. We'd do that relatively, infrequently in between election years, but very frequently, almost like once a month or a couple times a month, as elections got closer. So it's a very there's kind of like this standard research that you do with the clients kind of that we have when we do qualitative research, and there's a standard way you would run that kind of research. Polling always has many more layers of sophistication built into it, because you're trying to get the most accurate result as possible. You're trying to understand really, where the electorate sits with regards to the two different parties and the candidates, and it's public information that's going broadcast, obviously out to a wide audience, and there's a lot of reputation that is behind it as well. The television networks don't want to put out polls that are bad or polls that are inconsistent. So there's a lot more attention given to sampling. There's a lot more attention given to things like weighting. There's a lot more attention given to where potential bias might come from, and how to kind of correct for that. And so generally all polling, if it's done by a good institution that does political research, is going to use some more of these sophisticated methods to make sure that the sample that they're getting is as representative as possible of the population, and their intentions with regards to the politics that are going on. So, I mean, to break that down a little bit, and we've talked about this before, right? The single biggest thing that's most important to get a really representative sample of anything is how you select that sample. That's kind of critical, and a lot of polling will go to a lot of kind of lengths to make sure that everyone who is in the population who are potentially going to vote has an equal chance of being selected in the poll. And that's where you adjust for things like, some groups are much harder to get, some groups don't answer their phone as much, some people don't even have phones these days. All of those things make some parts of the population a lot harder to access. And you need to adjust for that when you're sampling to make sure that the parts of the population that typically aren't going to participate, they have a slightly higher chance of getting into the pot, so to speak, because you know that you want them to participate in representative kind of numbers, right? So adjusting for that bias is really important, and that helps give you a really good sample, like a good representative sample of the population. So that's typically always, that kind of they sometimes call it stratification sampling and stuff. That's always typically done, where you try and find, you break the sample into groups that have different response rates, and you try to get those groups in equal proportions or in the right proportions to give you kind of a representative sample. So that's really commonly done. I think I
want to. Yep. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine.
I was going to say, I think the response rate thing is actually really interesting, because I think it might be easy to assume that response rate has to do with the sort of proportion of representation in the population, but that's not what we're talking about with response rate. It's how hard is it to get those people to respond to a poll? Yeah. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. There's no it's the response rate is simply that everyone that you went out and tried to get in, how many people actually, how many phone numbers were real, how many people said yes, they wanted to participate. Like the response rate to a survey is basically, or to a poll is basically that. But you're trying to, and what though, when you start out and you do a lot of this, is that certain groups just don't respond in the same way as other groups. It's much easier to get older people to respond to these polls than as younger people, as an example. So you have to work a lot harder to get more younger people into your poll, because they're not going to respond at the same rate as, say, someone under 25 is not going to respond at the same rate as someone over 65. So you have to work harder to get the younger population in, and all political polling is adjusted for that. Like, and they go to there's it's not just age; they go to lots of different layers of potential response bias that they try to correct for.
Yeah. One thing I'd love for us to do is, and I'm going to reach out to someone I interviewed for the other show in the demo from Pew Research, Kim Parker, about introducing me to some folks who've been working on this question of political polling methodologies, because they've got some interesting pieces up on their site about pollsters are now in having to use multiple methods for their studies. They're having to sample different databases, use probability panels, use different methods of contact, because some people don't answer the phone and some people prefer online polling. And so in order to get people into the database, into the responses, you kind of have to flex to how they behave now. And I think for a while there, we were having these sort of debates about, is it all phone-based? Is phone-based still the gold standard? Or can we do online polling? And now clearly it looks like 2/3 of pollsters are doing some combination of methods in order to fill sample.
Yeah, I think and some are fully on. I mean, some are fully online, some are fully phone as well. I think the New York Times one you linked was fully phone.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that's an interesting debate, is just between the two different methodologies, because I think you get different responses based on the phone versus online as well. Like, people will respond slightly differently. Online polls in particular can be very sensitive to the way information is presented. Phone polls can be very sensitive just to the way the information is the questions are asked by the interviewer as well. So there's lots of methodological issues between those two things. I think that, it is very different now to when it was when I was doing political polling back in New Zealand. I think New Zealand is still a kind of an outlier, I think, in the sense that you have a relatively small population it's kind of easily accessible. We used to do political polling via phone, what they called CATI, computer-aided telephone interviewing, and something like 99% of the country was on the phone system, and everyone was in the phone book, and you kind of knew everything about the entire setup in the country because there weren't that many people. It was very easy to get a good methodology. You had response bias and stuff, but it was very easy to account for that. It wasn't really a difficult methodological kind of landscape in New Zealand. Here, it's much different. Yeah, because the transition away from like territorial phones, I guess, in households has really upended phone polling. The move towards mobile phones, the fact that some people, mobile phones are way harder to connect to one individual, and online being so much cheaper and easier and more accessible to do has also kind of folded it into the mix. So it is now, it's a very different landscape compared to what it used to be in places like New Zealand and probably 30 years ago in the US, where phone calling was much more of a viable way to do it.
Right.
So yeah, it's I think that...
Have you done much in the U.S.? I know we worked on a project where we talked to independent voters about a variety of things once, but have you been? Doing US stuff?
Yeah, we've done some political polling stuff, but mainly it's been for the campaigns of different or people supporting different campaigns of different candidates in different states and sometimes nationally. So a lot of that has been, I think you fall back and you use an online panel for that, or you might use some phone interviews, and you tend to do the basics in terms of accounting for all the differences that you might find in responses, but you don't generally do that research to the same level you would do a poll that was going to be publicly broadcast.
So let's talk about that for a second, because I think that's also a thing that people may not know much about, is that there is a difference between internal polls, partisan polling firms, and these public polls that are usually some kind of partnership between a polling firm or a survey, research firm, like an academic institution,
right? Yeah,
and a newspaper or a news network, something like that. And so you have like the Economist YouGov poll or the New York Times Siena College poll, and those kinds of partnerships happening. And I think it's the most revealing thing that I learned about why these things are different, because it's very easy to think, well, like, I do research, you do research, and talking to a pollster, and I had the pleasure of talking to Kristen Soltis Anderson and Patrick Ruffini once, and they really emphasized, like, look, we have to be super accurate because we're putting these polls out publicly and we're making predictions, and like our reputation rests on, was our prediction accurate or not? And when we're doing a survey for a consumer packaged goods company, their demands for accuracy and predicting are different. Let's put it that way. It's not the same.
Yeah, very different. And it's I think it's a fact that I think there's a level of kind of scrutiny around polling, because I think there is kind of there's this institution around polling that everybody is looking at the methodologies of different competitors and they're publishing their methodologies, and it's much more like an academic-ish kind of environment where if you publish your poll, you want to publish your methodology, you put it out in the public, it's going to be open to criticism by other polling institutions to say whether you did this or that. And I think that's good. Like, I think that keeps polling very honest and accurate, and I think that's a really good thing to do. But that kind of rigor is not demanded for the other types of surveys that we would do inside a consumer packaged goods company, something like that, because you're just not dealing with the margins. I mean, the margins of error that you're dealing with those polls, I mean, just not going to make much of a difference. So I think
so when you're doing internal work for a campaign or an issue group or whatever, Is it more like the work we do for our more like brand clients? Are they more looking for this kind of strategic direction as opposed to prediction? Are they doing some combination of the two? Talk a bit about that.
I think it's more strategic direction. I think a lot of the polling that I've done for political campaigns has been about, well, what are the issues and why do people care about the issues, and how do we craft a message around the issues that's going to resonate with people, they're not too worried about. I mean, we will do like likely voters, and we will do some weighting, and we will make sure that the age composition and the ethnic composition, all that kind of stuff is correct. But we're typically using like online panels or some other kind of online research tool where the cost is like a tenth of doing the computer aided telephone interviews. And so and then once you do that, there's not much you can do. I mean, you're just using an online panel, so you can't really do a lot in the underlying structure of that panel. You just have to understand and know that the panel you're using is a good panel, and you've used it before, and you trust certain panels and you don't trust other panels. But we don't get into all the complexities that, like, a New York Times would with regards to a telephone interview, and they're pulling voter files and all that kind of stuff, and doing response bias adjustments and things. But we might do, but we'll definitely look at making sure that the sample is representative. Look at likely voters. We'll make sure that if we get something that skews a little bit, we might do some weights to make sure it's like, it looks good. But they're not worried about predicting things. Yeah, they're just far more worried, as you know, about how they're going to craft a strategy to talk about issues that people are concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, that having worked on, the way that these things show up for us more is there is a matter of public debate or controversy that's relevant to whatever brand I'm working on. And we might incorporate a couple questions about how people are feeling about a particular topic. The first one of those that really comes to mind for me is years ago working on one of the HPV vaccines. And so having to be sensitive about the politics of that. But obviously we did some work with independent voters, and that was interesting for a variety of reasons. But one is just like the fuzziness of defining what an independent voter really is. And I know that the Pew folks kind of feel like there isn't really a lot of independent voters. There are people who aren't registered with one party or the other, and they lean one way or the other, and so they functionally are one way or the other. But I know that there's this desire to represent as
independent. There's a really interesting question that we had when I was doing political work back in New Zealand, and I remember this lady who I used to work with. She was she was a qualitative researcher, but did a lot of quant as well. But she came up with this idea of, well, I think we can push people to figure out what way they lean. And so we had a layered set of like 4 questions, which is which are you going to vote in New Zealand? It's like Labour or National, which is conservative, or Liberal or conservative. And you'd start off by asking which way you're going to vote, and then 20%, 30% would say they don't know. And then when you get someone who says don't know, you ask them, well, okay, if we really had to say, what would you vote? and we ask them. Then if they still say don't know, we'd be like, okay, then imagine if, in some scenario where they had to choose one or the other. And the funny thing was that if you went down through that layer of questions, like forcing someone to ultimately choose one or the other if they don't know, that was the set of questions that was most predictive of the outcome of an election. Was that if you divided everyone up into the lean, that was actually more informative than anything else. So it kind of supports the idea that if push comes to shove, people do tend to lean one way or the other, and it's not really independent.
So the other thing I feel like comes up, especially at this stage of the game, and I think we're going to hear less and less about this as we get closer to November, is the idea of most normal people are not paying close attention to the election.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
And so even if you get them, so you may have some response bias of people who they're interested, they're paying attention, they want to respond to a poll about this.
Yes.
But you also might just have weird answers in there because people they don't know what you're talking about. They're not actually engaged with this yet at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I watched that Chris Hayes clip that you sent through, and I love watching Chris Hayes. He's great. I mean, he's one of the best reporters, I think, on MSNBC for doing this kind of stuff, because it's always fascinating the take he has on things, and puts it in such a cool way. But he was all like, oh, this is 58% of people think that Donald Trump committed crimes, et cetera, et cetera. But there's one question in that poll that was like, how close are you following the charges around Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And that was probably the most informative question I saw in all the crosstabs of that New York Times poll, because only something like 20% or 21% of people said that they're following this a lot.
Yep.
The next one under that was like, I don't know, it was another 20% or 15 or something, was saying that they're following it like a little bit or some of it or something. And this is the problem with some scales we use in polling, is people think that
no, we're going to talk about Likert scales.
Yeah, we're going to talk about scales, right? I know, we're going to get to scales. People think that a lot means a lot, and a lot of the times it really doesn't. And it especially doesn't mean a lot if the next point you have is like sometimes. Because sometimes there's almost nothing. And then you've got almost nothing. And so what I looked at that scale, I thought, okay, then what's really happening here is probably only like 10% of people are really following what's happening with Donald Trump and have any kind of idea about the details of what he's been charged with and why. And most people are simply just gathering a bit of information, by osmosis as they go about their general day, but they're not really following it closely at all. And I think this is the reason it's so difficult for some pundits like Chris Hayes to talk about this stuff, because he always comes from a perspective of massive amount of knowledge about what's going on and can't understand the polling from his perspective.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to step back and forget everything he knows about Donald Trump and the charges and imagine that he's just some normal citizen going by and, Donald Trump's out there and there's some charges. I don't know what they're about, but he might be good, he might not. And someone that really doesn't care. Right. So that most people are like that. This is the hard thing. And this transfers to brands as well. I mean, if you do these surveys as we do for consumer brands, most people don't care about your brand. Like they don't really know what's going on and they haven't seen all of your messages. And it's really hard for marketers to get into the mindset of someone that doesn't know a lot about what they're doing, because they're so much in the middle of it all, right? And they just kind of have this like belief that everyone knows everything about what they're trying to do and accomplish and stuff like that. So I think it happens a little bit with journalists and pundits and political polls. It's like most people just aren't following closely. And that's why there's a huge kind of mismatch between what they think and what polls show.
The last two questions actually as you scroll down to the New York Times Siena poll, and we'll put the link to the crosstabs in the eventual show notes once this actually gets edited and published. But the question is, how much attention would you say you are paying to news about the legal cases against Donald Trump? And your choice was a lot of attention, some attention, only a little attention, no attention at all, don't know. So, taken together, the only a little attention and no attention at all, about 28% said only a little attention, 19% said no attention at all. So let's go ahead and call that 50% of the sample said, I don't know, I'm not really paying attention to this. And the other 50% says they're paying at least some attention.
Well, I think the thing is,
like a third of them are saying some, 20% are saying a lot. But to your point, what's a lot? No, and I was talking to someone about there's a piece in the Journal from a couple of weeks ago from a political scientist at Berkeley who had done a survey of 250 college students, asking them about some of their attitudes towards Israel and Hamas, and some like large percentage of them, when first asked about the statement from the river to the sea, said that they generally agreed with that statement, and then as they got exposed to more kind of facts about the conflict, they backed away from their support of that statement.
Right.
And so like the lesson here is, well, the more you know, I guess, right? Yeah. But the other thing is like, the question here is not then, well, how come these kids are going out and protesting? The question is like, how much do they really know about any of these things when exposed to them? And so like, you're asking me to register an opinion. Here's my opinion. Then you come back and ask me at the end of the survey, how much are you paying attention? And the answer is like, I don't know, a little bit, Yeah,
right. Exactly. And in the same way, if you started to actually, if the survey had a whole lot of facts about the cases against Donald Trump, and you asked people whether or not they thought these were true or false, I guarantee you, I'd bet my life and the life of all of my family on the fact that, this is just a sure thing, that a lot of people, a good 50% of people said, I'm paying a lot of attention, wouldn't know the majority of the basic facts about the cases. And that happens all the time. Yeah. Because our our assessment of how much we know about something is always overinflated in these kinds of polls, I think, and this kind of survey in general,
Yes. And this is, the example I gave to someone this morning was years and years ago, I worked on Microsoft Zune. And I'm sure I've told this story before.
I don't want to admit that, would you? Because I remember when you were working on Microsoft Zune.
Yeah. I mean, I do feel like I played a small role in killing it. And okay. so I feel okay about my role. But in the focus groups, we were talking to people about, MP3 players and downloading music and all that kind of stuff, and asking them about features. And the Zune had a bunch of features the iPod did not have and never had. So it had a FM radio. You could wirelessly transmit MP3 players between Zune, or MP3s between Zune players.
Yeah.
So if you happen to know someone who had a Zune, right, you were in luck. But when we asked people about these features, everyone in the groups was dead certain that the iPod could do it.
Yeah.
Well, iPod has that. The iPod has that. And it was like, does it? And ultimately we just concluded like their pre-existing belief is that the best in class MP3 player is the iPod.
Yes.
Any feature Microsoft's going to bother to throw onto that thing,
it will have,
the iPod obviously has. And so, like, I don't need to evaluate it, and you don't need to convince me.
Yep.
I'm just not really interested. I don't care that much about you to change my mind about you.
Yep.
And so if you're telling me you have better stuff, well, I think the iPod already has it. And what's funny is the question after the how much attention question listed here is, thinking generally about all the criminal cases against Donald Trump, which comes closer to your view, even if neither is exactly right? The charges against Donald Trump are mostly politically motivated. 46%. Donald Trump was charged mostly because prosecutors believed he committed crimes. 48%. Now, don't get me started on the formation of those two statements, but because I'm not sure that like prosecutors believed he committed crimes is different than being politically motivated in the minds of some people.
Yes,
but let's stipulate that maybe it is. It's even like, here's one where like we could start to describe something about this situation, and it's an even split, even though up top people are like, yeah, he committed crimes.
He committed crimes. Yeah. Yeah. No, it doesn't make any sense. Like, and it's interesting. I mean, this is the thing that I don't like this type of reporting for research. And I don't like it for what I do for clients that do this type of research, and I don't really like it for political polling either, because I think it's like, I have this saying that I use. I don't know if I've told you this. I think I made it up, but I might have stolen it somewhere. I can't remember. But it's like, if you take how, if you look at how say 100 people answer a single question, that is not as interesting as how one person answered 10 questions. And this goes back to, so you can always come up with a number that is like 46% or 50% of what any question you kind of ask. But it's all the questions prior to that question and after that question that an individual asked in a certain way that makes their response to that question interesting. And that is completely lost when you just look at it, the answers to any single question in total. Okay, so you can't understand like that question about, was it politically motivated or not, unless you start to look at it by the political party and what they know and don't know, and their support or not support of Trump and all that kind of stuff. Once you start to look at it like that, those things will start to make more sense. But as one result, I think it's inconsequential. And then you see journalists say, "Oh, well, this says this," and they start to make all these assumptions about why that might be right here, but something else over here does or doesn't support it. And it's like, no, because the original bit of reporting of that it's just not a useful outcome. Like, you can't really understand it in isolation and not take into account how people are coming into that question and how they answered everything else in the survey.
Yeah.
So,
well, and that's what's interesting with the second survey that he had in that segment, and we'll link to the Chris Hayes segment also. But the YouGov poll, which was of just shy of 3,500 U.S. adults, so not necessarily likely voters or even registered voters, but adults. The question is, do you approve or disapprove of the Colorado Supreme Court ruling that Donald Trump can't appear on the state's 2024 Republican presidential primary ballot because his actions leading up to the January 6, 2021 takeover of the Capitol amount to insurrection or rebellion against the United States? So that's a mouthful. But what he kind of looked at in the segment was the rolled up numbers, right? So the all adults, all respondents who answered what their answers were. Strongly approve 38%, somewhat approve 16%. So there you can round it up and say 54% are, at least somewhat approve of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision. Now, if you, click on the politics tab underneath the question, then the strongly approve group becomes very interesting because 63% of Democrats strongly approve, 12% of Republicans strongly approve of the Colorado Supreme Court ruling. And yet, and this happens a lot, right? When you start to see like taken together, top 2 box, answers on something taken together is 50+%. The press tends to report that as a widely shared belief of the public.
But it's not.
It's not, because it's not evenly distributed, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's like over here it's a widely shared belief, over here it is not. And the opposite is true. In fact, when you then look at the strongly disapprove numbers, it's kind of an inversion. It's 3% of even worse. It's like 3% of Democrats strongly disapprove. 58% of Republicans strongly disapprove.
And that's the better reporting of it, because all that question is doing is correlating with your support for the party, right? That's all it's doing. It's an internal correlation between, do you see yourself as a Democrat or Republican, and do you support Colorado's decision or not against Trump? It's like, that's not surprising. Democrats agree with it and Republicans don't. So, And that's the way it should be reported, I think, because that's the reality of it. It's simply just a correlation with party association, which I think a lot of the stuff is. There's so much of the stuff that's reported is simply just a correlation with party association. Sometimes they will break it down by Democrats and Republicans, and I think that's the less exciting journalism, when they break it down and they say, oh, well, Democrats kind of think this and Republicans think that. It's easier, as you say, to say, oh, the population thinks this, and that's interesting because there's all this support for Donald Trump, and where's that coming from? Well, it's just party affiliation that is driving all these questions.
And I definitely want to talk more on another conversation about this concept of expressive responding versus just kind of being misinformed. And so, because I think one of the other things that happens in polls that are public is questions that can kind of strike you as either, there's kind of 2 categories I think of here. One is the pop quiz question. It's like, that's a verifiable fact, whether something happened or didn't happen, or, whatever. And it's kind of like, why are we asking people this factual question that can be verified? It's not really a matter of opinion.
Right.
And the second one is the prediction question. So one of the other questions YouGov asked in that same December 20th sort of flash poll was, if the U.S. Supreme Court were to review the Colorado High Court's decision, do you think it would uphold the decision, reverse the decision? Not sure. So this is weird. Like we're asking average people to make a prediction about what the United States Supreme Court will do about a Colorado Supreme Court decision. And like, I went to law school and I'm not sure what they're going to do. Like, you know what I mean? And the question is, what's interesting is, again, 43% say reverse the decision, 23% uphold, 34% say they don't know. Which I want to just pause here and applaud the 34% for saying they don't know, because that's an honest answer. Right. And everything else is doing something else. So again, if I look at it by political persuasion, the Democrats are, pretty pessimistic. They're pretty evenly split, uphold, reverse, not sure, 34, 34, 32. The Republicans, 58% of them think they'll reverse the decision.
Yep.
That's interesting, but that's not how that got rolled up and reported either. No, it was more just like, what's the total number? Well, the plurality say they'll reverse the decision. But again, these are, this is this concept of expressive responding of, I'm a Republican. I think the court is Republican.
Yeah.
And so they will overturn this thing, and they better, because I want my guy to be on the ballot. And so like you have to, I love, that you brought up the how close of attention question, because it colors everything else. Like all the other answers in the question and in the survey are kind of modified by that question. And if you don't address that when you're talking about it, it's a distorted representation of what the survey actually says.
It completely is. I agree. Yeah, it really is. And this is where you have kind of made up information, I think, about like in made up stories, or stories that are made up based on like information that misrepresents what people actually think. Because if I'm asking a whole bunch of questions about, if you take any topic that I don't know much about and ask me a whole bunch of questions about, I don't know, bridge construction or something, you know, and you want me to give my opinion, and I gave it to you, and then you make up some kind of story about like how bridges are constructed, you're going to get it completely wrong, because I'm not an expert in any of that stuff.
No,
and most people aren't experts in any of these politics. So most of what you can conclude from this is just kind of generally how people feel. If push comes to shove, when you ask them about certain situations with regards to Trump, but they could completely change their mind if they were actually exposed to real facts and real information and more in-depth information, and which they likely might be as they get closer to an election, when people are usually much more attentive of what's going on and gather a bit more
and when they're just being inundated with more political advertising, with more outreach from campaigns, with more news stories, all of that. So with the kind of remaining couple of, do you have a couple more minutes?
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. No,
one of the things I want us to spend a little more time on, but because Iowa's coming up shortly, one of the things that I have been sort of ambiently aware of for a while is that there is one pollster in Iowa that the other pollsters love, and that the political pundit class love, and that's Ann Seltzer. So she works on what is known as the Iowa poll. There are other polls conducted in Iowa. There was a Suffolk University one or something that just came out the other day. But she's regarded as this sort of gold standard pollster in Iowa. And I guess a question, that, obviously on like the 538 website, they grade the various pollsters. They also mark the ones that are partisan, nonpartisan. Seltzer is nonpartisan. I think currently that is a partnership with NBC and the Des Moines Register and Mediacom are essentially the collaborators / funders of the survey itself. But do you have a sense of what makes one pollster better than another pollster, besides just like on average they're more accurate? Is that the thing? Is that the thing that makes them? It's after the fact we can say that they're the gold standard because they're so good.
That's interesting. What would make one pollster better than another? I think that. I think their kind of adherence to the rules of polling, like I think that is important when you're doing polling, like the extent to which you are going out of your way to make sure you can select a really good representative sample. Like I would put that probably at the top of the skills you need to be a really good pollster. So everything else will kind of like collapse if you don't make sure you are getting the most representative sample as possible. So definitely put that as number one. And I can't speak to like, I have no idea what she does for her polling, but that would be the first thing I'd kind of look at. I think the second thing I'd look at would be just probably the consistency or the historical kind of like legacy of the person doing the polling. Like have they done this for a long time? Have they maintained the same methodology for a long time? Because one of the other things that you can also kind of be sure of is that while there's lots of different ways to conduct a poll and different ways to get make sure you're getting good samples, if you're doing the same thing over and over again, the errors that you make are baked into every single result that you've got, which means that the errors are already part of the historical record of what you've been measuring, and therefore there's a good chance that things that are that you can compare your current result to historical, and you can see the way things are moving, and that the way things are moving aren't because of methodological changes that you're making to your polling. Because as soon as you adjust your methodology in any way, there's a good chance that might affect the results. So if you've kept the same methodology right from the start and you've been very consistent, then I think that is the sign of probably that you've got a pretty good handle on what's happening in the region that you're polling.
Yeah. And that seems to be the thing when she's asked about, what she thinks is essential to good polling. A lot of it is how the sample is drawn. I was reading, I think it must have been the 538 piece about her. And when she first came to the Des Moines Register, they were turning around polls faster by recontacting people they had previously polled instead of getting new sample. And so like the recontacts were skewing for, I don't know, George Bush, and the new contacts were skewing for Bob Dole. And she was like, I don't know, I think you're missing something here, because the people we've called before are saying this, and the people we've never called before are saying something else entirely. So we need to think about sample differently.
Yes, totally.
And so that seems to be, a big part of how she thinks about what she's doing. But it's interesting because I think there is then this, I don't know, almost kind of hagiography that's inevitable when you're a really accurate pollster. I mean, this, more or less happened to Nate Silver, which is, it's still very strange. I think one thing to say about Nate Silver is not a pollster, also no longer at 538, but not a pollster.
Yeah. No.
He's a guy who's like doing sabermetrics with polling data that's publicly available.
Yeah.
And so he's looking at all these polls and doing some averages and saying like, these are the odds I give for any given candidate or issue or whatever.
Yes.
And I mean, mostly candidates. And so like the idea that a prediction was made by 538 is, in 2016, for example, is technically inaccurate. They did not make a prediction. They laid odds on one side winning or another.
Yeah.
But because the odds worked out a bunch of times, not in 2016, but that's okay. They got to, he came to be, successfully predicted all 50 states or whatever, or 49 states, in terms of how their votes would turn out on general election night, 2012. That then becomes like, that's your credential in this space. Which is very, again, when I talked to Patrick and Kristen about this, I was like, aha, the difference between what you do and what I do is it all comes down to the one night that everybody makes their purchase decision. And I work on stuff where people are constantly making purchase decisions. So I don't have to make a prediction about what someone's going to do on Tuesday, because they've still got Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and into next week to make their choice. We're not running on the same timelines here. And so that kind of, it is interesting though, that like when they start to dig under, well, what is it that Ann Seltzer does that's so great? Like she just constructs really good sample. And doesn't try to like make the data say something that it doesn't say.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. That's exactly right. And I think, and it's interesting you mentioned Nate Silver, because I think that what he does is really important for political polling, and probably, I don't know, I mean, he's probably pioneered this idea of multiple polls and taking the average of the polls, the average of the polls, to try to understand what the probabilities are that things are going to happen. I think that's a really powerful way to do it. When you start taking hundreds of polls and average them up and have a look at where that average sits, there's a good chance you're tracking the reality of what's going on, because you're essentially, each poll is contributing a little bit to the overall end result, not entirely, and each poll has their own kind of issues and biases in it. So those kind of cancel out a little bit when you take the average of lots of polls. So I think that's a really interesting way to approach it. And it's kind of a layer above polling that is, that at the end of the day, the most accurate way to get an understanding of what's going on is to actually take multiple samples of something. If you can, right? Or lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of sample. And the more you sample you take, the better prediction you're going to be. So the more polls you'd make, the better you're going to be at predicting what's going on if you average all those results together. And it's just basic statistics. So I think what he's doing is really valuable, and I think really probably the most powerful way to think about polling and to track it is looking at how the averages of all the polls evolve over time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and so this is also, I think, another thing that we'll just, say as well about apparently Seltzer's approach, which is something that I'll just say, like, I'm trying to incorporate more in just how we screen people to participate in qualitative studies, which is we may disqualify people to participate, but we don't terminate their progress through the screening survey, that they take the whole screener. And then we can learn about the people who didn't qualify as well as the people who did. And, because we're not doing, again, sort of the traditional way of recruiting qualitative respondents is you're walking through the mall one day, someone with a clipboard comes up to you, they ask you if you'd like to participate in some market research, they ask you a bunch of questions, they get your contact details, now you're in a database. And then I call up a firm who has that, the firm that has that database, and they call you on the phone and ask you a bunch of questions and then qualify you. And they have incentives to get off the phone as quickly as possible because they're trying to keep their contact costs down. But these days we're using, often we're using customer lists, but we're also using panels like user interviews or respondent or SurveyMonkey or whatever. And in those instances, it doesn't cost me more to have everybody go through the screener than to only have the people that we know for sure will qualify go through the screener. But apparently she does basically this, which is that she takes the voter file, she asks a bunch of questions to see if they're likely to attend a caucus. Only about 1 in 5 Iowans do, or registered voters do. They are asked who they caucus for, but she collects data on everyone, not just the ones who say they will caucus. And so she's able to look at like all the registered voters plus the people who say they're going to caucus and know for sure who they're going to caucus for. And my guess is if you're asking the question of who you're going to caucus for, you're a sure thing, right? Like if you've already decided that you're going to caucus for Nikki Haley, then you're going to do that, at least to begin with, right? There's a whole different, we can talk about how caucuses work, I guess, if we really wanted to. I think that might be someone else's topic, not ours. But like, that's an interesting choice that she's making, which is collecting data on all the people she contacts, not just the ones who say they're going to participate. And then she can do some weighting based on those essentially like response rates and representation, like age, sex, congressional district, et cetera. But apparently she does not weight by past caucus or general election voting activity because she doesn't want to make too many assumptions about who's likely to caucus this time.
Probably smart. Yeah,
I think it's interesting to think about some of those things because in the meantime, there's a lot of fretting about weighting and sampling and did we get enough of these people and what kind of math are we using to get a readable answer versus method?
And the weighting stuff's interesting because there's two different ways in which you will weight. I mean, one way you might weight is if you were doing your sampling and you didn't get quite as many Black Americans that you wanted, or your Hispanic number was slightly too high. You will weight those groups down a little bit or up a little bit depending on what representation you want in the survey, right? That's just demographic weighting to make sure that your sample is representative.
And so weighting just means like if we were, if we want a value of 1, but we got, 0.8, then we multiply it to get to 1.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah. You just get it back up to the proportion that you know it should be that you were targeting, right? And the other weighting though is about this kind of like, if you ask a question about who are you going to vote for, then you can make some assumptions about how accurate someone's answer is going to be based on their past behavior. So if someone had voted in the last 4 elections, said they did, right? Then the person who voted in the past 4 elections and maybe is going to caucus in Iowa or something like that, you can ask them a bunch of questions about their past behavior. You can say, okay, that person's probably more likely to vote coming up than someone who maybe just turned 18 and said, yeah, I'm going to vote, but hasn't had any history. So you might decide to weight that person's answer a little bit higher because you think on the actual day of the election, that person's more likely to turn out than someone who says they're going to, but has no past history or behavior of actually voting. or a very weak past behavior of voting, right? So that's such a judgment call, though, and you have to be pretty you have to back that up with a pretty good kind of logical argument as to why you would do that kind of weighting. But that weighting is done, I know, for lots of lots of questions with regards to voting intention.
Well, and I think it's, the analogy in other kinds of work we do is well, this isn't the target audience, kind of
right.
bias of clients where they're like, well, they're not saying what I expected them to say, or they don't perfectly fit the criteria I had in mind, even though they fit the criteria we agreed to. And that happens a lot. But I think the interesting thing there is if what you're trying to do, if like you're maximizing towards the actual ultimate electorate and trying to model the actual ultimate electorate, then it's not unreasonable to think that the next electorate will be the last electorate, that the people who voted last time will likely vote again.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we'll do that. Except apparently when Lepore did the the analysis of 2016, one of the huge components of Trump's success electorally was people who had never voted before or who hadn't voted in a long time.
That's exactly where it breaks down. Is that any event could happen up and close to the election that might completely change the assumptions you had about who's going to vote. It could be an attack on the US. Suddenly, everyone's out voting because now there's the whole reason for the election has changed, has shifted. I mean, anything could happen. Any big event could shift that assumption close in, and that's why it can be dangerous to make that assumption as well. But generally, over the long period of time, over the long haul, that's going to be correct. That the electorate that votes now is probably similar to the electorate that voted last time, but there will be exceptions to that.
Yeah. So if you were trying to put your layperson's hat on, what do you think the average person would find most confusing about how to think about polls?
About how to think about polls, I think the average person who just kind of encounters a poll in any kind of bit of news, I think they probably tend to think that that's what the outcome is going to be, like that somehow the poll is predicting what's going to happen, and I think that's not right. But that could be necessary for a democracy, because if you think Trump is winning, the polling could have an effect on and if you're an anti-Trump supporter, that could have an effect on how much you're going to participate, right, and how much you're going to campaign and how much you're worried about stuff. So those polls can definitely play a role, but I think people tend to interpret them as like, oh, this is going to happen, when really that's probably not the case. I think that. I get a general kind of perception that people think people who know a lot about politics think everyone else is also informed. And you have to force yourself not to think that way. So if you're really into politics and you're like a diehard liberal and it's like you hate Trump and you see these polls, it's like, oh, how can everyone support Trump? They must be like, they must be aliens. There must be, people that must be awful. There must just be, but some people are supporting Trump. They just don't really know what's going on, and they haven't had a lot. I mean, Trump to them is still the guy on the frickin' whatever show he was on, The Apprentice, and he got into politics and some stuff happened to him, and so it's left, right, and it's Democrats and this and that, and but he's upending the system, and you don't like the federal government anyway, and so you're kind of a Trump supporter, and that's through the extent to which you kind of really understand what's going on. You're not like a bad person who agrees with everything that Trump has done. So I think that's the other thing that can be destructive. I think is that if you really like, because Trump is so divisive, if you're on the left and you see polls, you can think that there's a bigger gap that is happening between you and the rest of the country who wants to vote for this person than there actually is. Then I don't think that gap exists as much. I think most people who are Trump haters could sit down with people who support Trump and realize that, oh, these are nice people, they're interesting, they're just not paying much attention, and they have a completely different concept of what Trump is compared to me. But so polls can create, because of, I think we're in this weird situation because of who Trump is, polls can create this sense that the whole country has been driven apart with this massive divide, And I think a lot of it is just a divide on attention being paid to what's going on.
That's really interesting. I think that's right. And I think one of the indicators of that, a plug she does not require from me, is there's a podcast called the Focus Group Podcast that the Bulwark puts out, that Sarah Longwell hosts. And it's great because I think there's kind of at this, especially like last year coming into this first half of the year, I mean, obviously I have a bias. I'm a qualitative researcher, but like, I'd rather hear focus groups talking about this than read poll results talking about this. And one of the things that she's kind of consistently heard, I mean, I think we'll start to see that shift as the first few primaries happen. But there are a lot of people in her groups who are like, are we sure it's Trump and Biden? Like, we haven't had any primaries yet.
Right. Yeah.
And it's like, we're pretty sure. we're pretty sure it's Trump and Biden. But that's, but, also anything could happen, but there is this kind of, how can we know before the season really begins, who's already won the pennant? Like, that's a little weird. And so a lot of people who are not high information voters, as they say, or like deeply engaged in the news, are kind of, still in this holding pattern, waiting to see what their real choices end up being.
Yeah. Right.
And I think there is something kind of interesting that's happened, which I think like there is some kind of, we all have broken brains from the last several years, but like, I think there's this interesting kind of two bases for not trusting polls. And one is they don't say what you want them to say. And the other is, excuse me, is that if you're a bit more of a nerd about it, you like I said, there was a piece in the Journal or something a month or two ago that was complaining about the use of weighting in political surveys and talking about it as this like new thing that was making polls less reliable. And it's like not a new thing. And it's a pretty standard thing in survey research and in sample, and how to handle sample. And so, to your point about these things get published, we can see your methodology, we can, see the crosstabs. Amateur armchair poll readers get to take to social media to complain about what they think are methodological flaws in the research that may or may not be. Like, sometimes they are. Sometimes they're just sort of normal ways of doing things, and this is their theory of the case about what the electorate's going to look like. Or, and obviously, like, we can go into on another conversation also, like how questions are even phrased and how that affects the way that people respond to questions. And then the type of questions, scaled questions versus forced choice versus multi-selects, all of those kinds of things influence how people respond. And the order
of questions has a huge impact. I mean, just knowing that, just working in this area and seeing the result of just shifting in the order of questions in a survey, you could completely change the outcome.
Yeah.
And so that's a huge
and going
issue.
back to that New York Times Siena poll, I'm going to assume that they reported it out in the order more or less that they asked the questions, because it looks about like what
I'd assume they were asking. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And if that's the case,
if you wanted to change the outcome of that, you would just you'd ask all the questions about criminal intent and criminal issues with Trump prior to the question about who you're going to vote for. And I guarantee you, if you did that, you would actually drop Trump's support by probably 10 points, because suddenly people would remember that before they actually. So that's a huge difference.
Exactly. And I think that question even about how much are you paying attention to this, if you'd opened the conversation with that, I wonder, like, does that create a permission structure to say, I don't know more?
Yeah, I don't know. It totally does. I mean, I would be fascinated to see some of these companies do one poll that they've already done and do another poll where they just completely change the order of everything and start off with, how much are you paying attention? Are you aware Trump is, indicted for this? And at the very end of it all, ask who you're going to vote for and see what difference there is. Because I think that you're going to show that information, even delivered in a survey, can have a big impact on someone's intention around who they're going to vote for. And so that would just be a fascinating thing. I've never seen anyone do that, but that would be a fascinating exercise to do, I think.
Maybe we should get someone to give us money and we can try it.
We should totally do that. Absolutely. They're out of order. I'll start working on that. Maybe that can be a crosstab episode with some actual, like, real crosstab data we can
That would be fun.
The order of political polling questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think these are exactly the kinds of things that I want to kind of demystify for, obviously, look, if you're going to like say to yourself, I want to subscribe to a show called Crosstabs, you're probably a news junkie and a politics addict.
A politics junkie,
but you may not know a lot about how polling works. And so part of what I wanted to do with this was, can we just like get under the hood of like, how does this machine actually operate? And like, if I move this thing over here, does it change the way it works? And the answer is there's so many variables. So it would be cool to do one of our own. But I think we can kind of keep digging underneath the kind of elements that make up a poll that's, that you should. And I think another time it would be good to maybe get someone to talk to us about what does it mean to rely on a poll, and why would a voter rely on a poll? I understand why a campaign would, but I don't understand why just folks would. Right. You should, like, your vote is your opportunity to express your interests as a citizen. Yeah. What difference does it make what everybody else is saying? Then again, I have certain personality inclinations to not care what other people think, which is funny because I ask people what they think for a living. Who knew?
It's a mystery.
It's a mystery. I don't really care, but I'm curious.
But you're curious. That's right.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you for chatting with me.
It's been fun.
This is a little experiment. We'll see how it goes.
Yep. No, sounds good.
All right.
I'm in.
Crosstabs is hosted by me, Farrah Bostic, with Paul Soldera. Production by The Difference Engine and edited by me. Music from Audio Jungle by S Audio. Find us at crosstabspodcast.com, where you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter and find out immediately when new episodes drop. Tell your friends about the show, subscribe on your favorite podcast service, drop us a note if you have any questions about poll design or sampling or weighting or anything else, and we'll see you next time.